Lovely. So I chose, like Dr. Roberts said, the monthly from St. Mary of the Lake in Chicago. My section was mostly a lot of Bibles, all sorts of Bibles. Latin, German, Dutch, English, no French Bibles, which I thought was interesting, but needless to say, WorldCat was not cooperating with me as far as finding those Bibles, because you don't know how many Bibles are published under the name The Holy Bible in Baltimore in 1854. It's a lot. So I decided to stick more in focusing on the periodical section within my broader subject section, just because I also thought they were a lot more interesting and more indicative of the modern 19th century culture than a Holy Bible. So I will be talking about Chicago Catholics and American identity, and the etching here, the engraving here, is actually a view of St. Mary of the Lake, which was located, I believe, in the Gold Coast, just a little bit south of the Gold Coast area, around Chicago and State Street. And there are some more of our lovely bound periodicals, which are located in the basement of Cudahy, if you're interested in reading some. As you can see, there's a lot of them to choose from, but I ultimately ended up choosing the monthly because it was published in Chicago. It's the only periodical that we have still in the collection that was published in Chicago. And so I thought it was a very unique and very important periodical. And you'll hear more about its importance later on. So this is the cover page of the first volume. Oh, I had the book. I was going to bring it up so you can see it. It's a big, thick monstrosity and a really terrible binding. Oh, Jess is lifting it up. And just a little bit of background. St. Mary of the Lake was opened in 1844. And it's really struggled throughout its entire existence to raise the funds to keep the school going. And it eventually even turned to the priests of the Congregation of the Holy Cross, located at Notre Dame University, for guidance in improving the curriculum and encouraging more donations to the school. However, the school ultimately closed due to a lack of funds in 1866. And as you can see from the front page of this, this was first published in 1865, which means this magazine only ran for 1 year. A little bit more about the monthly. In their introduction, they have a very long introduction in the first volume of the periodical from January about why they wanted to publish this and who their audience was and why Catholics, they thought, needed a periodical. And so I just read some of these really interesting quotes. So it actually opens up with, quote, "Catholics of the Republic have the most powerful motives for supporting their press, which by its position and consequent influence can be at all times their most successful and efficient defender. We could certainly realize incomparably greater benefits therefrom if by a united and hearty cooperation we would give so mighty an element of our strength the means of increasing and extending its power." And so that's kind of their moment to call attention to the strength and the importance of popular periodical presses in defending the Catholic faith against criticisms from other Protestant presses and Protestant books at the time, and also about calling attention to the fact that a lot of these periodicals did not receive the funding that they should in order to maintain their production. And it's really notable that the monthly is bringing this up. I mean, it's also ironic because that's why they end up closing a year later. But it's really interesting that they bring this up because in 1865, the last year of the Civil War, of course, the monthly is the only Catholic periodical in the United States. All others have folded or have gone on hiatus, including Bronson's Quarterly, as well as the Metropolitan, which is a periodical that they mention in their introduction as being extremely important, and they actually suggest that all Catholics should have the bound copies of all volumes of the Metropolitan in their home. So we'll move on and take a little look at what was inside the monthly. It's a really interesting collection of basically anything and everything that could interest an American Catholic in the 19th century. So let's dive in. There's poetry and literature. The majority, especially towards the last half of the year of its production, there's a lot of serial stories. Of course, discussing morality and discussing the strength of Catholic virtue and Catholic faith and Catholic religion over that of Protestant materialism and Protestant/capitalistic notions in the late 19th century. So it's all about extolling and celebrating that special and unique Catholic virtue. And there's also a lot of poetry, my personal favorite being The Pipe. The Pipe was too long to put on here, but it's basically, I can imagine some Jesuit father's ode to his pipe, and sitting in it in a leather-bound chair, essentially, is what this poem is about. There's also, in every volume, there's also a short article about travel. And it's usually about, it's mostly about German cities, which I guess would play to the large German population in the city of Chicago, which Grace had talked about earlier. But there's also, they're not necessarily travel articles per se, but they're small, little interesting histories of local language or customs of, for instance, Ireland and Irish language. And so even if they're not necessarily travel focused, there are small histories of European countries that you might want to go and visit. The other most prominent theme that you see in the monthly is actually this seeking an American identity. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about anti-Protestantism in the magazine first, but I think I'll stick with this for now. So Catholics sought to claim a place as Americans in the United States during this late 19th century, middle 19th century period. And because the monthly was published during the final year of the Civil War, a lot of the patriotic rhetoric from the magazine is meant to illustrate Catholic support and involvement in the war effort. In the July issue, which is here, you can see there's actually a whole opening article by the editor about the church and its involvement in the war effort. And then later in the August issue, there's another very long article of a prominent cardinal discussing his views of domestic slavery and the 13th Amendment, and how he basically says that this is the most important thing that has happened in America ever. And it's a really interesting article to see how Catholics feel about and are supporting this new union, this reunited union. However, my favorite Civil War reference was in the very long miscellaneous section, which is in every volume, and it says, quote, "A Charleston paper hopes that South Carolina shall have the honor of finishing, as she has had that of commencing the war. We hope so too, and we believe that President Lincoln will soon grant, capital G, the prayer." Good joke. Yet, as much as they wanted themselves to appear as a part of a larger American culture, the writers of the monthly also sought to distinguish themselves from Protestant America. In a longer article about good government, there's a quote that says, "If we are to be rescued from the evils by which we are surrounded, we will only be so by recurring to the principles of Catholicity, Christian and Christian civilization, by listening attentively to the voice of the Church, and by making our religious principles our actuating motives." There's also a lot of anti-Protestantism and Catholic victimization in the monthly, in many issues of the monthly. And this is going back to Civil War really quickly. This was one of my favorites in the entire volume. It's a litany of prayers for the soldiers of the Civil War and for peace. It was really moving. It's really beautiful. I wish we could sit here and read it all. The book's right there if you want to. There was also a lot of scientific news in every volume. So you can see there's some notes on astronomy here, more notes on astronomy. This actually made me think of all of our presentations that we heard about science, in that the editor here says that it is to be regretted that so many Christian astronomers have vied with the ancient pagans in the superstitious absurdities with which they have endeavored to surround the glorious works of our God. And it's basically a critique of all of the constellations being created by the ancient Greeks after like snakes and bears and things like that, which is very interesting. There was also a really interesting article on the unity of the human race, and about the discovery of Neptune, and there's just so much science in all of these magazines. It's just incredible. But they're all very, likewise with all of our other scientific texts, very tinged with Catholic belief and Catholic feeling. To me, though, the most interesting sections were these where you could glean a little bit about what life in Chicago was like during the mid-19th century. And you usually got most of that in these musical chronicle sections. They are basically musical reviews for whatever kind of opera or ballet or symphony is being played here in Chicago. And the first one actually is all about all sorts of music in Chicago, not one specific opera or ballet. And one of my other favorite quotes is, "There is much music here in Chicago. If there be in the land any singer, any instrumentalist, or any minstrelsy who think themselves qualified to appear before the public, they unhesitatingly take their way to Chicago. But alas, how many of them are sadly disappointed." And they go on to talk about like brass bands that just walk through the streets and stop in gardens and start playing for free public entertainment. And it's just, like I say, it's a wonderful way to just get a little glimpse into cultural life in Chicago in the mid-19th century. And with all of this really seemingly schizophrenic subject material, in a way, to me at least, this single periodical represents the entire catalog of St. Ignatius. It's all of our different books in all of our different sections, all compiled into one volume. And it has literature, it has poetry and theology and news and travel and science, and it literally is, to the editors at least, everything that a Catholic reader in America might need in order to be both a well-read and well-educated American and a well-educated Catholic. And that's why I think that this particular periodical is just so incredible and so important and really meaningful to our project. Thank you. Oh man, I left the joke out. That's okay.
So, like Professor Roberts mentioned, my project is going to be on the spaces in between the library books, or the silences in our library. So I don't pictures as the live books as I commence. So historians are used to silence. We've toiled in the quiet of archives, fretted through the oppressive hush of exams, and faced the unbearable muteness of historical actors. It can be said that our lives are framed by silence, and we've grown accustomed to the limits it sets on us. When we find exactly what we're looking for, we don't shatter the quiet of the archive with an undignified whoop of joy, or at least we disavow all knowledge of having done so. We don't curse at our exam questions, at least not out loud. And sadly, we often resign ourselves to the silence of our historical subjects, a silence that is born out of silences of and in the archive itself, a lack of textual noise. In researching the books of the original St. Ignatius Catalog College Library, we found a remarkable number of them, about a third, still surviving, but the vast majority of the books are no longer there. The spaces left by these books are, for me, just as interesting as the stories of each of the books you've heard about tonight. And this is the silence of the archive, a lack of material noise that can be used to explore and undermine the idea of silence and of archives. And it is in this process that I hope to make the very silence speak volumes. In this intent, I'm anticipated by many. Michel Foucault, for one, articulates his project of archaeology of knowledge as one centering on the idea of the archive as a set of often unarticulated rules that govern for a particular society in a particular time the limits and the forms of acceptable discourse. This includes conservation and specifically, quote, what utterances are destined to disappear without any trace, which are destined, on the other hand, to enter into human memory. Particularly useful for this project. The framework of Foucault's interrogation of the past then dispels the idea of the archive as just a massive text to be placed in very quiet buildings for historians to root around in. For Foucault, the project of archaeology is essentially a project of questioning the very act of survival, denying the privileged position of the surviving records, materials, or even oral narratives in telling the truth about the past. In the work of Jacques Derrida, the archive is even more unsettled. For him, there is an economy of memory at work, one in which the historical actors compile and dismantle their own archives in turn. This abnegation can be by choice, as in the burning of personal documents before death, or it can be buried with latent intentionality in the very framework of production. Letters, for instance, may be kept, lost, passed on, or misused. By their very production, one can imagine their preservation, but in their very corporality, they bear promises of their own permanent erasure. Following these readings, then, I'm not just interested in the silences for what they tell us about the things preserved, or even the possible empirical events that led to their absence. Instead, I see them as a means of destabilizing the relationship between those books that remain and those that are lost, and the methods and politics of preservation, rediscovery, and historical narration. The ultimate goal of such a project is, quote, disorienting the teleological promise of archival claims, as historian Anjali Andrikar has put it. This approach is common among post-colonial, queer, and feminist histories and remains a vital reminder that the past is shifting ground, and every historical moment is, in the words of another post-colonial scholar, Shahid Amin, a recalcitrant event. This destabilization of the archive or library does not, however, demand its destruction. Instead, the archive itself becomes open to analysis as a historical text with its own politics of production. And reading around the silences is a challenge in creative thinking, but one that I found to be particularly rewarding, as it embeds the narrative of this library within the larger story of the roles of libraries in the late 19th and early 20th century public culture. Having suggested this, it's only fair that I end with a quick relation of a couple of the more fascinating aspects of library culture that have come up in my research. This will, I hope, help articulate my approach to this collection in a more concrete fashion, as well as save this short talk from its dangerous flirtation with pretension. The first I found in the 1937 handbook of the Elizabeth and Cudahy Memorial Library that Dr. Roberts has digitized in preparation for this project. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's online. It's really good at answering some of the questions that we've been asking. In the potted history of the St. Ignatius Loyola Library, it offers a glimpse of the library during a painful moment of transition. In 1922, when the library moved from its original home at St. Ignatius College to the Lakeshore campus, where it is today, the books lay in stacks for 6 months, waiting for shelves to be built. Once shelved, however, according to the author of this handbook, for some reason the collection's full catalog was either discarded or lost, and financial strain or simple lack of training prevented the librarians of the next 7 years from ever rectifying the situation. Things were so bad that a system of open shelves was instituted during this time, and borrowing and browsing happened without the usual systems of documentation. Of the supposed 90,000 volumes, a number that the author of the handbook describes as a wild surmise on the parts of the non-cataloging librarians, Nearly a third were lost during this period, either from theft, misplacement, damage, or careless weeding. Weeding at night is another of these curious themes that crops up between the spaces and the shelves. It's something that's come up often in my reading. All libraries require weeding, which is the purpose removal of books that no longer fit in with the library's overall collection, in order to make room for the growing number of newly published works that the libraries need to stay current. I investigated this practice from modern theories of weeding by algorithms to theories espoused by 19th century libraries in the American Library Association's professional journal. What is curious is that constantly librarians advised what I like to think of as stealth weeding, or weeding at night. As librarians in the room know, library patrons are among the most stubborn idealists, and no matter how the idea of finite space is explained to us, we never cease to be appalled at the idea of giving away, selling, or as they did in the early days, burning of old books. It doesn't matter that I will never want to check out a book that has an incorrect or incomplete map of the American West, drawn before the Rocky Mountains were fully explored by cartographers. For me, there's something comforting in the notion that should I ever feel the urge to consider the Spanish territories of Mexico as geographically near Montana, I can go to my nearest library and just have the map I need in hand. Weeding thus has always struck patrons as an unreasonable activity, and librarians in 1870 advised one another in the columns of the Library Journal exactly what librarians of today write to one another in reference and user services quarterly: do all your reading at night. Thus it is that when finally heard, the silences of the archives can be like this: funny, idiosyncratic, or just plain strange, like the nearly century-long obsession with the idea that contagious diseases could be passed via books, or the detailed accounts of just how often librarians should wash the pages of the books under their care. The stories that come from listening to this aspect of archives both rounds out the narratives that we can tell and ultimately reminds us that archives must be interrogated, inspected, and finally overturned.
How do I do this? From beginning. Okay. While working on this project throughout the semester, I've repeatedly been struck by the amount of travel books in the St. Ignatius College Library catalog. Of the 317 books in my segment of the catalog, I found that 87, or 27%, are travel books. It was particularly striking for me to find that of these 87 travel books, 47, or 54%, have survived and are in Loyola's library today. Of these surviving books, 6, or 13%, are still located in the main stacks of Cudahy Library. This comparatively high number of surviving books has led me to question why the 19th century Jesuit fathers felt it was so important to obtain so many travel books, and in particular, why so many have survived over time. I decided that the best way to begin to search for answers was to turn to the books themselves. After isolating the travel books from the segment, I began to look for trends based on various parameters to see if any trends did exist, and whether they could provide additional information on the travel books that were obtained for the library and which books survived. With much help from Dr. Roberts, I created 2 Google Fusion maps based on some of the information available on the travel books in my segment. The first map contains a list of all of the travel books found in my segment of the catalog. Based on the bibliographic information found in the catalog, Cudahy Library, online research, or the books themselves, I was able to plug in information and establish parameters for isolating specific information and for searching for trends. As you can see in the screenshots on the slide, I set up the location search options to include locations named in the book's titles,
the places of publication, and the places of travel, which can be searched specifically by city or broadly by country or continent. Once I decided on how I wanted to determine location, I set up search filters that would, hopefully, allow some trends to become apparent. At this point, these filters include author, title, number of volumes, place of publication, date of publication, places of travel, survival, current location of the books that did survive, and the language that the books were written in. Here, I've provided a few examples of the types of searches that can be done and the type of information that can be extracted from the maps. On the map on the left, I performed a search of the places of travel of the books published between 1800 and 1850. As you can see on the right-hand side of the map, you can click on the location and information will pop up on all of the books about travel to that location that were published within the year selected. After looking at various publishing parameters, I found that all of the books published before 1750 are about travel to Europe and Asia. From 1750 to 1850, all of the travel books are exclusively about travel to the United States and Western Europe. From 1850 on, the places discussed in the books are scattered all over the world. From this example alone, we might be able to hypothesize about the places of interest around the world during certain periods of time based on the types of travel books being published at that time. This is, of course, just one example with a small amount of data to extract from. But if not suggestive of larger trends, this data does, at least, tell us about the types of travel books that were of interest to the Jesuit fathers at St. Ignatius at certain times. Search parameters can also be looked at in terms of popularity and frequency, as you can see from these examples of heat maps, which are my favorites. Here we can see that most of the travel books in the segment were published in New York, and that most of the surviving travel books are about travel to the United States and Europe, particularly Italy. For our class's Luma exhibit, I decided to focus on one of the surviving travel books that is still located in Cudahy's main stacks. While there were several books to choose from, 6 again, I chose Arctic Explorations by Elisha Kane because, unlike many of the other travel books, Kane's book is still in print. As you can see on the map on the left, Kane had traveled extensively prior to his participation in the famous Grinnell expeditions on which Arctic Explorations is based. In his 30s, Kane was already somewhat well known for his travels. By the end of his second trip to the Arctic, he was a full-blown celebrity explorer. It makes sense then, to me, that the Jesuit fathers would not only want to obtain the first edition of Kane's book on his second Grinnell expedition to the Arctic, but also to hold on to it over time. There is still a lot to be learned from the Fusion map on the library catalog travel books and from the map on Kane's travels. In the future, I plan to merge these maps and look at how the trends found in the travel books map might apply to the maps of Kane's travels and possibly vice versa. In addition, there are many more search parameters that can be applied to the maps that might reveal additional information about the books, including, but not limited to, the popularity of the books at the time of publication and which books are still in print. Overall, I hope that further research into the books and into Kane's book in particular will reveal some of the answers to our questions about the St. Ignatius College Library Catalog.